Cool, all right, thanks for coming. If we could start off by getting you to tell us your name, degree, and year of study, and also your campaign colour and slogan.
Sure. So my name is Manousaridis. I am studying a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Laws in my third year. I am running on the colour purple, and my slogan is Tom on top.
Cool. And just by way of icebreaker, we need all candidates to do this. Could you tell us your favourite USU production of recent times?
Our Women's Review from last year.
Okay.
It was so good. It was really, really, really good.
Cool.
Hands down best.
Cool, all right. Moving on. Are you a member of any political party?
Yes, I am.
And which party is that?
The Australian Labor Party.
Cool. How long have you been a member of the LP?
I think since the first half of 2017.
Okay,
Yep,
so
first year of
first year?
university. Yeah.
Cool. And in terms of student politics, could you give us sort of like a brief history of your involvement in kind of any student elections?
Yep, sure. So I'm also a member of Student Unity.
Mm-hmm.
I ran in 2017 for the SRC, the 90th Council that year. I was elected as a councillor, and I also served as a general executive over the course of my term. And I've campaigned for a variety of different SRC and USU campaigns, if that's also what you're after. So the Stand Up campaign in 2017 and the Reboot campaign last year. In terms of USU candidates, I campaigned for Claudia Gilgrams and Diaz in 2017 and Connor Barrett last year.
Cool. So you mentioned you're part of Student Unity. Have you been a member of that faction since first year?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And has that faction pre-selected you and endorsed you for this
Yes, they
election?
have.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Do you intend to continue as an active member of the faction? To what extent does your faction inform your decision-making process? And how will you work alongside other members of your faction on the board?
Sure. So first of all, I am currently the convener of Student Unity at the University of Sydney. Although I'm not actually managing my own campaign for obvious reasons. That's being done by Liam Thomas. In terms of remaining an active member, I do intend to. However, in terms of my decision making on board, that's we're not necessarily a binding faction in terms of meeting at caucusing before every board meeting and deciding how each member of Student Unity that may or may not be on the board of a particular year will vote on a particular issue. So that's all done individually, and that's the expectation. However, as just a general principle, I'm looking to work, if I do get the chance to get elected, work collaboratively with every single member of the board, regardless of their political affiliation or their factional membership.
Cool. And you mentioned Liam Thomas is your manager, and he's also a member of Student Unity?
He is, yes.
He is, cool. I might hand over to you.
Cool. I guess we'll start with what inspired you to be to run, put your name up in the race, to be on the board of this multi-million-dollar organisation.
Yes, no, that's always a bit scary when you think about it like that, isn't it? So I mean, there's a few different reasons, but I think if I were to sum it up, it's ever since I started at Sydney Uni, all of my social networks, all of my friends, all of the exciting stuff that makes uni awesome outside of the classroom has been fostered in some way or another through the union, whether that be through the Clubs and Societies program, whether that be through the USU outlets that I meet my friends at for coffee and food and things like that. It's all been based and sort of, I guess, provided for by the union. So in that sense, I feel as though I owe a sense of gratitude almost to an organisation which has sort of made my time at USyd so far amazing. More than that though, I have also had a fair amount of experience with the USU in a variety of different areas. So I've been on the executive of a couple of clubs and societies over my time at USyd. I also worked for the USU from the end of last year sort of until I nominated this year as one of the campus activity coordinators. And I think through those experiences, I've seen all of the amazing things that the USU has done and has the potential to do, both from different sort of perspectives as well. So I've seen the good, and it's allowed me to develop some ideas which I think would be an asset to the incoming board of directors.
Cool. You mentioned you have a lot of experience, campus activity coordinator, shade, souls. I guess, do you think overexposure to the union's programs means you're less likely to bring fresh ideas or a novel insight into how they could be improved? And do you think as a result of your overexposure that might actually compromise your ability to bring new ideas to to the union in the next 2 years?
I don't think so. It's a very fair point, though. I mean, having sort of been involved from quite early on in my time at USyd, it's a fair thing to ask. But as I said, whilst I do think that a lot of the programs that the union does run are really great. I wouldn't be running if I didn't think that there are things that could be improved upon. I'm sure we'll probably talk about this later, but one of the things which was a big sort of, motivator to run and to sort of change how things work a little bit was the change to the CNS funding this year. That's obviously quite a contentious issue, and I assume will be dominating this year's election from a variety of different candidates. I don't think that was a great decision by the board for a number of reasons.
Sure, we'll talk about those later in the interview.
Sure.
We'll go back to that.
Sure.
Back to Access, I guess. How long have you held Access membership since your
Since my first year? Yeah.
Cool. And if you had to identify the most important USU program, the one that's sort of most important to all students, not just yourself, what program would that be?
It's tough to say because obviously I think the union does cater to a variety of interests, but in terms of actually catering to that variety, the Clubs and Societies program I think would generally be accepted, hopefully by most people, as one of the most important, in the sense that it's not it's a program that allows for students to run clubs and I guess initiatives that are of interest to them. And I think that in doing that caters to a very, very wide array of students, not just me, who have particular interests, obviously, but sort of catches as many people as possible and allows them to, as I said, build those really important social networks at university, so they don't, go through uni feeling isolated and just part of this, amalgamation. Yeah.
In the lead up to an election, candidates typically seek support from a number of different groups on campus. Usually groups that they are already members of. Have you sought support from any student groups, colleges, residential accommodation associations, staff members, societies that you're a member of, anything like that?
I haven't been campaigning yet, obviously, since the you're not allowed to campaign until this Saturday when social media campaigning begins. Obviously, in terms of getting support for my campaign, I've asked probably more so, not necessarily groups per se in terms of putting people into blocks like that, more so just my close friends that I guess sort of fit a variety of those different groups, but no, I haven't targeted in particular any sort of established parts of the university, more so reaching out to my friends that happen to be members there.
Do you have any plans, or do you have you identified any groups that you think you would particularly like to seek the support of, or that you'd particularly like to serve as a board director?
I want to be a board director for every student, as many students as possible. I'm not looking to box myself into, I guess, any particular group on campus. I mean, the role of a board director is to serve the students, not just those who elect you. I think that's something which is really important to consider and remember when you are running, as you said, for a massive organisation which is funded by students' funds. It's not just funded by college students, it's not just funded by members of SULs or Shades or what have you. It's funded by everyone. So no, I'm not looking to serve the interests of one particular group over the other.
Sure, but you've obviously had an overexposure to some of those societies, which means you have a high propensity naturally by being in those groups that you understand their interests better than, for instance, students in clubs that you're not a part of. You accept then that there are gaps in your understanding.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And in terms of filling those gaps, obviously, no board direct. That's the point of having 6 1 year, 5 the other year, so you can hopefully fill those gaps. And for my own sake, I would love to be as collaborative of a board director as possible.
Sure. The spending cap for this year's election is $700 per candidate. Do you intend to exhaust the spending cap?
We'll see how we go. Obviously, we will use up to 700 if need be. At the moment, in terms of budgeting, we are looking to probably not necessarily exhaust that, but if we have funding to spend, we will probably spend that.
And I guess as part of your campaign equipment, will you be using A-frames or core fluids?
Core fluids.
And will those core fluids be recycled from previous campaign?
No.
Sure. How have you gone about raising the remaining $700, I guess? Are you fundraising? What else are you doing?
No, I'm actually trying to bear as much of the cost myself. I intended, I've got savings which I was either going to use for something, whether it be travel or moving out or something, but I don't want to sort of put the cost of this campaign, which is, it's obviously my name and my candidacy, and I want to be funding it myself through my savings from casual work and things like that, as much as possible.
There's a sizable number of candidates this year. What makes you, if you could drill it down to one or two things, what makes you different to the other 9 candidates, right?
Yeah, it's there are a lot of, as you said, really talented candidates and experienced candidates too, but I think that something which differentiates me is, I guess, the exposure to the USU over the course of my 3 years. I think working for the USU as campus activity coordinator and working, a part of that role really involved working with a variety of different stakeholders and the different USU portfolios, which I think exposed me personally quite well to a lot of the different groups that the USU needs to serve. And I think that's experience which I have, which other candidates may not have. I also think this probably isn't necessarily something that would, differentiate me from others, but I'm a massive valuer of hard work, and I think that getting onto the board, not to say that other candidates aren't, of course, but I intend, if I do get the chance to serve and get elected this year, to work as hard as I possibly can, as you said, to fill those gaps of knowledge and dedicate a lot of my time, all of my time, to the role.
Which other candidates would you say you sort of identify most with or share the most with?
Probably Nick Forbett, I think. I mean, obviously, that's so you might be seen as a cop-out answer just because he is also, Labour left. But more than that, Nick and I have been quite good friends, I think, since for a few years now. We've also I've worked on the Mental Awareness and Health Society with him as an executive. And we worked really well together there, and I think we both have quite similar value systems, obviously, by virtue of, being affiliated with the same, strain of, politics. So, yeah.
Which candidates would you say you sort of share the least with?
That's quite hard to say. I mean, I think in terms of, from what I can say, I don't really want to, say a particular candidate, because from the looks of things, everyone I think is coming, well, most candidates are coming to the selection this year with the goal of, making the USU as good as possible. I mean, in terms of politics, policies, obviously there's quite a differentiation between, at USU, at least myself, and potentially members of grassroots, for instance. In terms of just the vision of the USU, obviously there's, I guess, differentiators there.
There's actually no grassroots candidates, right?
Sorry, I'm switch aligned candidates, Prudence and Ellie, more so. Not to say that we don't get along quite well, but in terms of, I guess, how we see the role that the USU plays on campus. Yeah, I think that would probably be a differentiator there.
Cool. Looking at the incumbent board, what would you say have been its biggest shortcomings over the past year or two?
The shortcoming would be the implementation of the new funding system for a number of reasons. I'm assuming this is, okay to talk about now at this point. A couple of reasons. Obviously, this sort of came in tandem with free access, which I think was actually one of the board's biggest successes, this current board's one of the biggest successes. But the process in which the funding system was rolled out, I think, was problematic for a few reasons. First of all, there was quite a lack of student consultation. Myself as a treasurer of, 2 societies last year and now Shades, the information session for how the new funding system would actually work was only held on the Monday of Welcome Week, and a lot of different societies have, in order to compensate with that change in funding, they have to change membership fees, et cetera, et cetera. However, that can only be done, at a GM 2 weeks' notice, which is impossible after Welcome Week happens. So, and I think that the lack of consultations with the different stakeholders, such as the executives of the clubs and societies, and also, the staff more generally, and the wider student body, I think that could have been done probably a bit better. And also just the tight time frame, I think, of doing it was not sufficient to allow people to prepare, as I said.
Cool. What do you think, aside from sort of reforming the CNS funding model, which you've touched on, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that sort of lie ahead for you potentially if elected, and the board more generally? Yeah, I mean,
I think in terms of what I think that will be quite a hard thing is, I guess, making students sort of understand the value that the organisation provides. obviously, as you know, we've clearly touched on in this interview, the majority of my experience with the USU is through the programs department, both as an employee and also as an executive of clubs. But that's only one way that people connect with the USU. I think that what sort of problem more generally and more broadly is disengagement with student unions and I guess disengagement with students understanding the real value that these student unions provide. So in a broad sense, I think that is something that the board through, you know, I can't really quantify an exact, you know, activity or, you know, outcome per se, but I think that is one of the broader challenges. Did you also want me to like more specific, I guess, like programs that the board needs to run? Or
I mean, sure. If you want to touch on that.
I also think potentially making sure that we are as inclusive as possible. I think that free access again is a fantastic step forward in that, making sure that people from, you know, different socioeconomic backgrounds, people of, you know, different minority backgrounds as well, disabled people, etc., are included in the union. I think that sort of reducing the financial barrier in that sense was a fantastic step forward. However, what the union needs to do, and I guess this does kind of tie into, you know, what we were talking about before, is making sure that however we, you know, choose to go about our activities and, you know, both in terms of, you know, CNS accessibility and also, you know, food, drink, all of those other fun things that the USU does, making sure that as many people as possible can actually access those. I think that's going to be one of the challenges that the board has to face, not just for my incoming cohort if I do get elected, but also the cohorts to come.
I guess taking you back to the candidates you share the least views with, you mentioned Switchline candidates, Prudence and Ellie. It's interesting in that perspective, I guess, and if we could get your comment on this, that'd be good, that you actually share a number of policy similarities with them coming into this election, which is quite, and you actually share a number of policy differences from candidates that Unity has been interested in working with in the past, candidates like Katie Brown, who has a moderate Liberal affiliation. Would you rule out having any preference deals with the Liberals at this election in the same way that Unity has in previous SRC elections worked with the Liberals?
Yeah, I'm not ruling out any preference deals with anybody. As I said, I'm not actually. The majority of negotiations for preferences is being done by my campaign manager. But no, I not just ruling out with any preference deals with moderate Liberals, but any faction. It's for us. Everything's on the table.
Sure. Would you be able to talk about any of those preference deals at this stage?
No, not at this stage.
I guess we'll talk about the current union board and board directors on the board that you sort of admire, current or historical.
Yeah.
Are there any that you sort of especially look up to?
Well, obviously, in terms of the current board, I campaigned for Claudia and Connor. Well, yes, because they are members of my faction too, but more so, I'm very good friends with both of them on a personal level, and I've seen the dedication that they bring to the organisation and just, you know, other activities throughout their life in general. I really value hard work, and I think both of those two on the current board really embody that, which I think for any position, whether it be a student union or otherwise, is just so important, just showing that you have, in terms of the past, Alicia, we have to love Alicia, she's fantastic. The energy that she brought, the, I guess, you know, wow factor that she brought to the union through bringing in, you know, things like, you know, Shannon Knoll performances, fantastic, you know, a classic and quite a famous thing, but I love the energy that she brought. I thought that was fantastic, yeah.
What do you think have been the biggest achievements of Claudia and Connor as USU board directors?
Well, Claudia obviously as honorary treasurer would have had quite a big part in the free access decision. I think that is a fantastic thing, which, as I've said, this particular board has done.
Sure.
Connor, he campaigned on, you know, sort of student services and focuses around like things like food trucks, making campus life more vibrant. And this year, I think, especially working with the programs department, the staff have really sort of taken that on board, and you know, things like food trucks. The USU now owns a food truck. I think that's fantastic. And you know, I think that's something which is really fantastic.
Sure. You've mentioned you want to prioritise student interests like every other candidate. How would you define student interests? How do you think student interests have changed historically for the union?
Yeah. So yeah, that's I'm assuming that's sort of like touching on the I guess, the tension between providing student services and providing, being a sort of activist body, if I'm understanding sort of the thrust of your question correctly. The way I see student services that the USU should provide, those are the services that students can use day to day. Per the USU Constitution, a lot of the objects of the USU is, things like providing subsidised food outlets, subsidised social and cultural facilities, subsidised childcare. All of those are different, objects of the USU, which I think is, sort of the bread and butter student, welfare concerns that at least I see. However, I also acknowledge that in the USU Constitution as well, it also notes to, act in the best interest of both the USU members and the wider student community. And that, I think, can't really be fully separated from the activism side of things on campus. I think that activism has been, upheld by the SRC really well. I think that I do think having both of those two unions are very important because, as I said, I do think that the predominant sort of, definition that the USU should adopt of student services are those essential student services. However, I don't think it's, fair to completely rule out blanket statement-wise that it shouldn't include, student activism as well, per se.
Sure. Obviously, the union has engaged in activism in the past as an institution. It's taken a lead on phasing out plastic straws, for instance, on outlets. It's otherwise been at the forefront also of political debates on campus. Given that the union receives greater staff funding than the SRC, should it not be the case that it takes a stronger role in relation to fighting for student interests, especially when it comes to activist campaigns?
I think that I don't think that it should necessarily be the main body that fights for, those forms. I mean, as to, those forms of activism that you mentioned, such as, phasing out plastic straws and things like that. That is also within the remit of what I described as, providing those essential student services. I don't think it's a bad thing at all for both student unions to work in collaboration, though. And I think that should never be ruled out, and both student unions should have a very good working relationship with each other.
Cool. Moving on to sort of the transparency of the union. The SRC has kind of adopted, both the executive and the council have adopted a propensity to kind of move in camera quite frequently, or more frequently than councils in the past during meetings. And the USU is known to sometimes do the same during board meetings. To what extent do you think it's important that the union remains transparent to students? When do you think it is appropriate to move in camera or to withhold details of the operations of the union from students? How important is transparency to you?
Extremely important. I think as much as possible, both board directors and the organisation more broadly do need to be as transparent with students as possible. However, I don't think it's fair to say that moving meetings in camera shouldn't be allowed. The reasons such as discussing remuneration potentially of different staff members, obviously quite a private concern for the individual staff members involved, and I think other obviously would have to, I suppose, make a decision depending on what issue came before the board, whether I thought that was appropriate to move in camera or not, because it's quite hard to speculate about what might come up. However, in terms of my value of transparency, it is very important to me, and I think that as much as possible the union should be transparent in its operations.
What about, for example, the remuneration of senior executive like the CEO or higher ups like that? Would you consider that differently to perhaps like lower level staff remuneration?
I do think so. However, it would, it is still an individual's pay, and as someone that does really value workers' rights, all workers' rights, I think that it is important to be a bit careful in terms of, saying whether the discussions for that, for the pay of any individual should be public or not. I think that, potentially in an annual report, then it's okay to be disclosed, as they are the sort of CEO of the organisation. However, in terms of those discussions on board, I'm not entirely comfortable giving an answer either way, I don't think.
Communicating openly and regularly with USU members is sort of cornerstone goal of the USU in its 2017-20 strategic plan.
Yeah.
The last time there was a sort of major reform to communication channels between board directors and students, and between the union and students broadly, was probably Coco Gong's WeChat policy, which came in 2017. Since then, there's been no major reform to the communicative channels and dialogue, which is probably also a broader problem that you've recognised in the form of consultation and the absence there. What efforts will you take generally to increase the dialogue between the board and students?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really important issue that you've raised as well. I think obviously, as the USU does send out, very regular communications via email. However, that's not necessarily the most, I guess, readily accessible thing for students to access and go, oh, okay, if I have an issue, I'll send an email. It's not necessarily what most people kind of drift towards immediately. I think that the USU should be employing social media as much as possible, and I would never be open to, I guess, as has been floated in sort of previous SRC campaigns, drop-in sessions with the board, just an informal sort of setting where students can come and actually raise their concerns with the board. I mean, obviously they can do that at board meetings, but I think that is quite a formalized setting. I would not be opposed at all to have those sort of open drop-in sessions publicized on all social media channels to encourage students to really challenge and engage with their board directors.
Sure. You've mentioned social media as one sort of medium of dialogue. In terms of your own campaign, what social media platforms will you be campaigning on? Student Unity in the past has actually utilised BuzzFeed. Will you do something similar to that?
Yeah.
Will you be exclusively campaigning on Facebook?
At the moment, we're looking at campaigning on Facebook and Instagram.
Sure.
Yeah.
Last year, USU Board Director Conor Ware considered campaigning on WeChat, something which ultimately fell apart.
Yeah.
Are you going to campaign on
It hasn't come up at this stage, no.
Sure. Let's talk about, I guess, one of the first things that USU candidates have to engage in if they're elected, the presidential elections and executive OB elections. If you're elected, how will you approach deciding who to vote for in that upcoming election?
Whoever's the best candidate, plain and simple. Who, and I know it's like, who is the best candidate? It would obviously depend on who puts their hand up to run. I have, that has not been anything that I've considered really at all. I don't know who potentially is going to put their hand up to be the president of the USU for next year. However, I would aim to sort of, talk with whoever the candidates are, understand why they want to run, and I guess challenge them on their record. And based on that, based on their record, based on if they have served the student body and interests of the USU well, that's ultimately where my vote would go.
So if through that process you determine that the candidate that best serves student interests is not a unity-aligned candidate, you will then vote accordingly for a non-unity candidate, is that right?
If they were the best presidential candidate, then yes.
How are you going to manage your time next, if you're elected, next year, the year after, to balance your directorship? Will you take time off study?
At the moment, the plan is obviously to reduce my CNS commitment. I have already done so. I didn't recontest at the Mental Awareness and Health Society AGM. I'm also not a member of council on the SRC anymore, obviously, in terms of balancing time with study. At the moment, if I do get elected, the plan is to do 3 subjects during the semester and 1 during, the winter or summer school periods, just to ensure that I can actually dedicate as much time to the role as possible.
Sure. Accessibility for international students to the union has relatively improved in recent times compared to in the past. Do you have any policies that cater to that student group on campus? How have you come to conclude those policies are useful? Sure.
So broadly, it ties into sort of my focus on the student programs and making sure that that department of the USU gets as much attention as possible. The international student programs team that works at the International Student Lounge, I actually collaborated with quite closely during my time as campus activity coordinator, and seeing the work that they do, which is actually its own complete operation, which, as you said, has I think really served to improve the accessibility of the union to international students. That is something that I would love to continue to see happening. They have dedicated staff. The USU has dedicated staff that have worked with the international student community a lot more than I guess perhaps the programs department over at Manning House. in some circumstances. And I think making sure that they get the resources that they need to continue doing coming up with ideas and programs to really include as many international students as possible with the union, I think is a fantastic thing.
Sure.
Just touching briefly on satellite campuses, the USU's often kind of criticised for neglecting satellite campuses. People often cite what happened at the con last year when it went through an extended period with no on-campus food outlets. I know personally myself from having campaigned for ONI at Cumberland that they often feel neglected by both the SRC and the USU. Do you acknowledge this? Do you have any tangible plans to ameliorate this? What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think it is extremely problematic to be focusing, completely on the Camperdown campus. I mean, obviously, it is a balancing act that the USU has to play. There's limited resources, and the majority of the University of Sydney student population is on the Camperdown campus. However, I don't think that's any reason to neglect these campuses at all. In terms of ameliorating, obviously, I would love to see permanent food outlet established at the con again, as well as some form of subsidised food service at Cumberland as well. I also think that doing things like that, again, this is very vague, but it is something that I have considered deeply when, especially during my time as SRC, sort of seeing the outreach programs that the SRC does, even, today, for instance. But I think, more does need to be done, and it would also serve to connect those students on those satellite campuses with the union more so, and develop, I guess, a more cohesive student community through the union. So I think it would actually be in the interests of the USU to prioritise more funding and, I guess, resources to those satellite campuses.
Cool. We might move on briefly to sort of finances. You've been a treasurer yourself on several clubs and societies, as you've mentioned. The recent rollout of universal access was made possible with the help of a near $1 million offering from the university. Do you see an offering like that as any indication that the USU is potentially reliant on the university? Do you think there's anything problematic about that? Do you have any concerns about kind of the USU and the university becoming overly entwined?
Right. Yeah. No, it's a very valid point to raise, but I guess it's important also to understand obviously the relationship with student unions and the university, in my opinion, does need to be healthy. That is the point of, having two Senate-appointed board directors sitting on the board, and it is also one of the, it's part of the objects of the USU, again, to have a, good working relationship with the university. In saying that, though, the USU also, at the same time, in tandem with that constitutional objective, has the constitutional objective of acting in the best interests of the students. So no, I do think that $1 million offering, I think is the result of a good working relationship with the university. I mean, obviously, the specifics of how that figure was decided, I, don't particularly know, as I wasn't on board at the time. However, it is important to have those good working relationships with the university, but not pushing over for everything that the university demands that we do, if that answers most of your question.
That kind of leads on to my next question, which kind of relates more to SAF allocation. So obviously, USU receives vastly more than, for example, the SRC, sort of roughly almost 3 times more at this stage, as well as recently the near $1 million offering from the university in order to roll out universal access. The USU is kind of often more associated with, politically anodyne service provision, stuff that's not particularly problematic for the university, whereas the SRC is often more associated with, activist, oppositional politics, quite critical of the university. Do you see, firstly, do you think the SAF allocation, particularly with respect to the balance between the SRC and the USU, is equitable? And secondly, do you think there's any danger of the USU becoming sort of the university's lapdog, for want of a better term?
I think in terms of making it of it being equitable, the USU is a much larger organisation, obviously, and I think that it is fair to say that the USU impacts more students more directly than the SRC does through its service provision and through its activities and other sort of performances, whatever it may be. In that sense, has a much further reach than the SRC has. So in that sense, I don't think it's necessarily unfair that the USU does get more funding. However, what would be a big shame, in my opinion, is if the SRC got steamrolled in terms of for staff allocation. I think that as I said, the SRC does serve its own purpose, and I don't think that it should be necessarily receive any less funding than it already is, particularly because the SRC does have staff that it needs to look after. It does have office bearers that it needs to provide compensation for.
Mm-hmm.
But again, in saying that, the USU has more staff that it needs to provide for, and I guess in that sense it's not necessarily unequitable. In terms of being the laptop, I guess that sort of does tie in with what we were previously talking about. It's always a danger, especially when you do have, I guess, that sort of close relationship with the university. Ultimately, though, I think it's up to the vigilance of the student elected board directors to ensure that, and recognising that working with the university is not inherently a bad thing, but to be wary of any sort of capitulation of things which will detriment students.
In the draft policy statement you provided us, it's fair to say it's mainly service provision oriented.
Yeah.
However, there's some activist leanings in it. One of the things you've cited is campaigning against the naming of this building, the Wentworth building, which is named after one of the colonial founders of the university. Do you think, as we've mentioned, the kind of like potential reliance of the USU on the university, this sort of close relationship, could impede activist efforts or related campaigns that are critical of the university, such as the Wentworth one you've mentioned?
I mean, it could potentially be construed that way, but I also think that I don't think that the I think it is an easier thing to say that these sorts of campaigns fall on deaf ears when it comes to the university listening, and perhaps in the past that is true. This has been a campaign policy for board directors in the past, however many campaigns. However, no, I don't think that having those sort of interests, I guess, that are at the forefront of the board's decision making, is going to necessarily detriment the university. The university recognises that it is an independent student union, I think. And again, so long as the board directors that are elected are keeping these things in mind and not capitulating completely, I don't think that it necessarily damages the working relationship that the USU and the university would have.
Just keeping on the topic of the Wentworth campaign, the uni's also got a statue of Wentworth in the Great Hall. It's also got a competition and a medal named after him. And the VC recently quoted him in a anti-discrimination message to staff and students. You've mentioned changing the name of this building in your draft policy statement. Where does that campaign end? Would it include potentially renaming that medal, removing that statue, and on top of that, would you consider in a similar circumstance publicly criticising the VC for quoting this figure? I'm just wondering where the bounds of that campaign.
Well, I want to say that this sort of whilst it was only in relation to this particular building, the reason why is because it is a building which houses a lot of the USU services. So in that way, it is directly linked with the USU's capabilities. However, I don't want it to end there. Obviously, it would involve liaising with someone that's not Indigenous and Indigenous Australian. It would be a liaising with the Indigenous Australian student community. But in terms of the decolonisation of the university, I don't think it should stop at necessarily just renaming the Wentworth building. I think those other things that you mentioned would be included in sort of a broader campaign. However, again, the question needs to be balanced of will the USU be able to achieve such a thing? However, no, I don't think it would be limited necessarily.
Would you personally consider criticising the VC for quoting William Wentworth?
Yeah, if that's if obviously it has deeply impacted the Indigenous Australian community, and I don't think that that should, in Australia's, I guess, continued attempt towards reconciliation, I think that we need to be really vigilant, and it doesn't necessarily have to be I think it needs to be said that we need to be very conscious of the words in which we choose, and things like, you know, the Vice Chancellor quoting someone who, you know, offends quite a lot of people. I think that is problematic, so yeah.
Cool, let's talk about pulp. Would you want to see the USU introduce KPIs or benchmarks in the quality or quantity of articles published by pulp? Do you have any vision on what pulp might be in the future?
Qualities and KPI, that's always, you know, a bit... I'm, you know, as a big supporter of independent student journalism, I don't think that KPIs are necessarily a good thing. So I guess in terms of that question, no. Where I see pulp going, I think that the editors this year have done a fantastic job of sort of balancing those two sort of, I guess, you know, engaging articles which focus on pop culture, student life, different things like that. And also, I guess, that more, you know, student political side of things, or the more inherently political side of things. I think that that's a fantastic direction for the publication to be taking. The quality, I think, this year is great. So in terms of the services it provides, I think it should, you know, act like a fully fledged student publication.
Sure. I'll just take you to some case studies historically that the union has faced. But a more recent one that comes to mind is Panda board director Zheng missed a number of meetings this year, sent in apologies. In a recent meeting, his apologies were voted to be accepted. As part of the block that accepted his apologies included Student Unity Board Director Claudia, as part of the block, included Connor, and as part of the block that voted to reject his apologies was Claudia. Given that Unity isn't a binding caucus, how will you approach dealing with other board directors with issues like attendance at meetings?
I think that it is, you know, it doesn't reflect well on a board director that campaigns allegedly in the, you know, student interest to be missing a number of meetings. However, again, it will depend on the case-by-case basis. Board directors are people too. They may be suffering from mental health issues, long-term illness, chronic illness.
Sure. Taking you to the specific case where Zheng was missing from meetings because he was attending meetings for his air conditioning company. In that specific instance, would you have voted to accept or reject his apologies?
How many board director meetings had he missed?
2 at that point, and it was his third.
By that point, probably not, no.
Sure. In terms of other sort of case studies, do you believe the USU should sort of align clubs and societies to its political stance? If the USU takes a political stance publicly that it is pro-abortion, for instance, should it accordingly vote to reject life choices?
No.
Sunday?
No, it shouldn't.
In no case, should it?
I don't think so, no. And the reason for that is, as you know, in the life choices example, whilst I am someone that is, you know, vehemently pro-choice and supports a female identifying person or a non-binary person with a uterus's decision to have an abortion, and as someone who personally thinks that the sort of rhetoric that life choices espouses is quite, you know, disgusting, for lack of a better word, it sets a dangerous precedent to ban a club based on a political stance that they take. And that could lead to, for example, if the board one year is, you know, dominated by right-wing leaning board directors, that could lead to things, you know, like banning the Socialist Alternative Club or, you know, the ALP Club, for example, which I think is a dangerous precedent to be setting.
Sure. You earlier talked about the working relationship between the USU and the university being one that's reasonably effective. Aside from the funding changes, the funding injection for $1 million, the USU is also being effectively enlisted into the university's campaign to crack down on contract cheating. Are there any instances, is that a specific instance where you think it might not be acceptable for the union to work with the university?
Well, in that instance, I think that was because at Welcome Week, and I could be wrong, so please do correct me, but from what I understand, there were sort of, there was contract cheating material that was being handed out by clubs at registered, you know, that had stalls that were provided by the USU. So in that sense, no, I don't think that that's an inappropriate working relationship to be having. Again, you know, we do go to a university at the end of the day, and academic integrity is extremely important, both as, you know, students and future employees, in whatever profession that might be. So.
Sure. And finally, in on case studies. In 2012, former USU VP Tom Rowie leaked a confidential USU report to student media, which showed evidence that the university collaborated with police against student strikes. Would you, if exposed to similar information in this specific case, have also released that information to student media?
Well, that was a breach of fiduciary duties, if I'm correct, so no. I do think that what could have been done better is the board dealing with it internally. But no, I would not breach fiduciary duties, and in that particular circumstance, I wouldn't breach fiduciary duties.
Are there any circumstances in which you would breach fiduciary duties?
No, because those fiduciary duties should be in the best interest of students anyway.
Sure. In extension of your answer to that, would you therefore always vote to censure a board director who releases private information to the public?
Yes. If that's a breach of fiduciary duties, yes.
I might just add on one more case study, if that's okay. As you would know, last year, SULC, the Sydney University Liberal Club, hosted a talk by Bettina Arndt, who alleged that there was no rape crisis on campus, contrary to a lot of the activist efforts of the Women's Collective and others. The Women's Collective then protested that talk. There were some reasonably almost violent altercations. There were a lot of people there. There was large police presence. The university then charged the Liberal Club for the security presence at its event. What's your position on USU clubs bearing the costs of security for events that are protested, such as Bettina Arndt's, and specifically in the case of Bettina Arndt's?
Yeah, it is a tough one. I mean, whilst I think that Bettina Arndt espouses some horrendously dangerous rhetoric, and think that as a personality she's completely inappropriate to be held at an event. Again, I do respect the right of each club to host those events, but equally I deeply respect the right of protest to occur at those events. If security is to be provided, I think that in terms of individual clubs bearing the cost, I think it should be a USU cost, like not necessarily individual members of the executive of a club. That potentially could lead to, for example, again, in a different scenario, divisive, very far left figure that might lead to counter protests by sort of far right leaning students or members of the community. I don't think it's fair for, students who want to host those events to bear the brunt of the security costs. So I think that the USU should, for those extreme sort of events where there might be altercations, bear the brunt of that cost.
So that would be the union more broadly bearing the brunt of the cost as opposed to individualised clubs?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Sure. So the USU also plays a bit of a bridging role and connects students to a number of its sponsors, biggest evidence for that being Welcome Week, for instance. Do you think there should be some sort of ethical test that the USU conducts when it comes to vetting companies that are able to put up stores at Welcome Week? This year, Commonwealth Bank had one of the most prominent store locations on campus following a Royal Commission, which found that they had exploited young people for a long time. If elected as a board director, would you be in favour of more stringent ethical testing of sponsors?
Yes, no, I think I would. I think it's really important to be, again, this is it ties into what I was talking about earlier in terms of the board directors being constantly vigilant. It's very easy to just, go with the status quo. I've done this for, however many years. I think an ethical framework is a great idea. Ensuring that the USU allows sponsors to come that, are supportive of their workers and, what have you. So, yeah. Sure.
You've talked a lot about prioritising student interests, but when it comes to staff, in 2017, the USU voted to stay open during an NTEU, which is the National Tertiary Education Union strike. Last year, it also failed to take a stance on the proposed degree in Western civilization, and talks with the Ramsay Centre, which again was heavily condemned by the Sydney Uni branch of the NTEU. How do you see the union's relationship with the NTEU and with staff more genuinely?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that NTEU strike, I do think that the USU should have closed its operations for the day. Again, it does depend on each specific circumstance. It's so important to be in discussions with, the union that is whose membership is the staff at this university. So in that sense, I think it is extremely important to be working as closely and collaboratively with them as possible, to have an open dialogue about issues that a potential action might have on the USU's operations and vice versa. Yes, in terms of the specific example of the Bachelor of Western Civilization, I do think because of the questionable academic rigor of this degree, as well as on a personal level the racist undertones, or I guess overtones really, that this degree has, or this potential academic program does have. I think that the USU probably should have taken a stance in that, as it was an issue which I think a vast majority of the student community were engaged with and were unhappy about.
Sure. I guess taking it back to your policies, your policies include mention of mandatory sexual assault disclosure. Can you maybe talk us through what that policy is about?
Yeah, so just from personal experience as a club executive, I've had at various events, obviously I won't name in relation to which club or what exec, students that have come up and disclosed issues surrounding sexual assault. And it is extremely challenging for, as an empathetic person, of course, you think you know what you want to do, but there is obviously a lot of specific and I guess more tailored steps that someone who has been disclosed to in relation to a sexual assault offence or sexual misconduct of any form, how to deal with that appropriately. And I think that all club and society execs that are hosting events should be trained with how to deal with the disclosure, the channels that they can take, and to assist the survivor, and also for their own benefit, so they don't suffer from secondhand trauma as well.
Sure. So just to clarify that, is the policy, what aspect of this policy will be mandatory? Is it the training aspect?
The training, sorry,
or is it the disclosure aspect?
The training. So the training for how to deal with sexual assault disclosures, sorry.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
And have you any idea what organisation will provide that training?
Not sure yet. That would be a decision that I would love to make in collaboration with the rest of the board, if elected.
Cool. Maybe just touching on one of your other policies, which is the need for what you've called recharge spaces, low noise spaces around campus for people to relax and kind of recharge. What differentiates this from, for example, a library or Victoria Park, or one of the other sort of like ambient spaces around campus? Where would this kind of space exist? Would it be a new structure? Would it be a renovated structure? What differentiates it from sort of current low noise spaces on campus?
I guess just in terms of proximity and having a space which isn't if in the library, for example, that's quite usually full. Having a space where it's quite comfortable, also accessible for everyone, because I know that as someone who is queer, I've used the queer space for similar things such as this. Just as a space on campus where you can actually go and it's quiet and relaxed at those times of high stress. My vision in terms of that policy was to have it open to everybody in hopefully USU buildings in terms of where that would go. Obviously it would be a balancing act of potentially converting a USU owned room, or again perhaps even liaising with the university, which has been done before, to introduce a space in one of its buildings, or even a new structure. The specifics of that would obviously have to be worked out, seeing whatever options that are available to the board at the time. So, yeah.
Sure. You've also said you want to cap food prices at a new and affordable food outlet run on campus. How will the USU negotiate a cheaper price point, given that a lot of outlets on campus, USU outlets on campus, are already here because they are price competitive for the student market, and because in the course of negotiations they are asked to tailor their prices to that market. Are you going to approach negotiations with a food outlet in a different way in order to ensure that prices can be capped? And will you consider a Macca's on campus, given Macca's is cheap?
Well, I think that the idea for this was to actually open an entirely new outlet, which provides, affordable and also, I guess, perhaps healthier meal options than because there are obviously different, tiers of USU food outlets. Obviously, Courtyard being, like a more luxury tier of food on campus, and sort of things like Fisher Coffee Cart being one of the cheaper, more affordable options. In terms of actually making sure that this does get off the ground, it would again involve negotiations with either dedicating an existing USU venue, for example, the courtyard aspect of courtyard, converting that into obviously, because whether it would work in the long term, it would have to start off quite small, I imagine. So either sort of working within the space that the USU already has, or again, like Fisher Coffee Cart, for example, is a perfect example of how liaising with the university can actually give the USU and an outlet more like dedicated space like that. But again, those options are open. In terms of ensuring that the food pricing is capped, I think that needs to be at the forefront of all sort of negotiations. And I guess in terms of a business case, it wouldn't just be students that are on low incomes that would buy food there. I think a lot of students would really value having the cheap meal option that is actually affordable. So in terms of business case, I think it would be quite competitive both for the USU's operations more broadly and also the university too.
Sure. Speaking of business cases, the USU is obviously a corporation. A number of your policies mention effectively revenue outlay measures, things like presumably subsidising happy hour at USU licensed venues, arranging for the payment of student singers, comedians, actors, etc. Do you have any revenue raising measures planned in order to fund some of these policies? Where do you see the funds coming from, more generally? Yeah,
so I mean, obviously it's extremely hard to give you an answer on that, given that I don't have access to the specific financials of the board. It would have to be decided once I have access to those documents, obviously. But I guess sort of thinking more broadly about how that would look, it would probably be a matter of I think that there would have to be trial periods involved with these things. Happy hour, for example. Logically, it would make sense that if students are, I guess, enticed necessarily that these drinks are perhaps cheaper, then they may buy more, for example. It would also probably, involve budget reallocation. Again, the specifics of that I can't really give you an answer to due to the fact I don't have access to the finances. So yeah, unfortunately that's as probably clear as I can go with the information I have.
Sure. You've also voiced, we talked about this earlier, CNS funding. You've voiced some changes to the CNS funding system, including doing a consultative review. Beyond sort of the buzzwords of consultative review, how is this different from the sort of CNS town hall forums that the USU is already running, which they've already run and are still running into this month? As well as the report back from the USU president after the first semester of universal access. Yeah.
So a very fair question. I think that whilst the town halls that I guess the USU is running currently, is a good start. I still think that it is stifled in, I guess, the ability of students to engage with staff of the USU and also the board directors. I know for the first one that students had to submit questions. What I imagine this consultative review being is a long process, ongoing for however long it needs to, potentially 6 months, giving students open forums, open opportunities, like in a normal town hall, where students can go without previously submitting questions, ask questions of the board, and provide suggestions, and also provide more formal sit-down, I suppose, opportunities for club and society executives particularly to go and voice their concerns and allow the board to gather a lot of data and a lot of information that can help them reform the system, which I think is potentially not at its best and broken as it currently is. So in terms of how that differentiates from it currently is, I guess, making it more open and making it a long process as well, which actively has events that are targeted to students, USU members or otherwise, club and society execs, and connecting them both with the staff of the programs department and otherwise the CEO and board directors.
You've mentioned 6 months as the potential time frame for a review. Would you champion a regular review like that every 2-3 years to sort of, I guess, test club and society satisfaction with the union? If you would pursue that path, would you champion constitutional reform to require USU consultation with clubs and societies?
I think that's a fantastic way to go, so yes, I would. It's always important, again, it would also serve, again, the objects of the USU to be, serving the interests of its members and also of the student community broadly. So yes, I would. In terms of constitutional review, obviously that is a much more, I guess, formal and stringent process, but if that policy was successful and took off, then I would absolutely consider it. Would not be opposed to it at all.
Sure.
Cool. We're approaching an hour, so we might wrap up there.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you've got any more questions. Maybe one last question. How are you feeling about the next couple of weeks? Do you have any major fears? Anything you're particularly nervous about? How do you feel about... I know you've declined to comment on your preference deals, but how do you feel about the other candidates? How do you think things are shaping up? Just your general outlook.
Just like how am I feeling? Oh, well, nervous, as I guess you would, but also I'm genuinely really excited to get out there, talk to students and see what they think about my policies, learn about what they want from the board as well. Win or lose, I am just excited to put myself out there and see, offer students my vision. And I guess, go from there. In terms of the, I'm not really thinking too much about preferences. I'm just, focusing also on my campaign and, just getting excited about, getting out there and chatting to people.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.